Welcome, everybody, to our World War II presentation on the war in Russia. As early as 1924, when Adolf Hitler was just the leader of this up-and-coming Nazi political party, he had called for the conquest of the Soviet Union, claiming that Germany needed Lebensraum, living space, to the east. And, after losing the Battle of Britain, he broke a previous pact he had with Stalin and launched an attack against the Soviet Union. He and Stalin were just bitter enemies, and so Hitler really wanted the Soviet Union. Of course, it's a vast territory; it's a huge amount of land. And in June of 1941, nearly 3.6 million German and other Axis troops poured across the Soviet border, from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. And nearly 3 million Soviet army soldiers, they called themselves the Red Army, opposed this onslaught and were poorly equipped and not well trained. And so it's going to be a crazy time over in Eastern Europe. The Soviets were unprepared for the intensity, the brutality, really, of the German attack. The Luftwaffe quickly gained control of the air. The German ground troops drove deep into Soviet territory, and in the lands they occupied, the German troops began rounding up and executing large numbers of civilians. And so what the Soviets did was to adopt a scorched earth policy, kind of an ancient technique that you'd use to destroy everything useful to the enemy. Uh, you know, as you retreated, you destroyed everything along the way, so the enemy would have nothing to use when they got there. And it just it was just horrible. Some of the very worst and most fierce fighting of all of World War II happened in Russia. And let's look at a few of the major places that it occurred. Before we do that, though, let's look real quick at some of the Russian military uniforms. And you can see, obviously, going to be more cold weather stuff, but there's your officer uniforms, your soldier uniforms. Your pilots, your naval personnel, and another officer. Pretty plain, pretty utilitarian, right? Although the officer uniform looks pretty cool. The Soviets did make a few of their own weapons, a few of the weapons they used, and probably their most famous handgun was the NAGANT M1895. The issue with the Soviet army, though, is that again they had a lot of people, a lot of troops, but they were poorly trained and didn't have enough equipment, didn't have enough supplies. So how do you take on a German military force that's just a dominating army? How do you take that on if you don't have enough supplies, right? And then their carbine rifle that they would use. Um, Again, pretty basic stuff. I mean, they weren't nearly as technologically advanced as the Germans or the Americans, and so they fought with what they had. And then the Fedorov automat is another. It's a little more fierce looking, especially their look at the bullets, right? But a little more fierce looking rifle. And the Soviet special, right? The Molotov cocktail, which basically is a homemade bomb. It's a homemade bomb slash grenade. And they would use this against tanks. They'd use it against, anything. Use it against the enemy soldier, you name it, right? Basically, you get an old bottle and you put gas and oil in it, about halfway up, a little more than halfway, and then you tape up the top area. You got a wick in there, okay, and you light it on fire, and you like basically a grenade. You toss it before it blows up, okay, and so these things could do some serious damage, but they weren't they weren't high tech, But you can see how many Molotov cocktails these guys are just building there in the upper right. I mean, just just go to work, just have them on hand, so when you need them, you need them. So anyway, these are some of the Soviet weapons. Here are some Russian troops in training. with their rifles and their bayonets. More troops in training. I like this picture, even though it's a little blurry there on the, especially on the left, the center left. But they're kind of in the middle of the snow, you know, and they're marching along. Here's another one in the snow, the cold. Okay, with their guns and their. I mean, look at the guy on the far right, second row back. That's basically Andre the Giant. What is he, like 8 feet tall? So, but yeah, this again, the Soviets had a lot of men, just weren't ready. They weren't trained properly, and they didn't have enough equipment to be effective, as effective as they would have liked to have been. Now, you will see though, as we talk, ultimately Hitler does not conquer the Soviet Union, and there are reasons behind that, and part of it was the fierceness of the Soviet troops. All right, this brings us to the Battle of Stalingrad. From the fall of 1942 to the uh, early winter of 1943, this Battle of Stalingrad is going to be really the place the Red Army decides to make its stand. And of course, the namesake of their leader, Joseph Stalin. It's a major industrial railroad center, a major hub for supplies coming in and leaving. In mid-September of 1942, the Germans began a campaign of bombing and shelling the city. For more than 2 months, they just tried to bomb out everything they could and tried to soften it up before they sent troops in. And the Soviets took up positions in the rubble. I mean, they bombed out houses and buildings, and so by the time the Nazi troops get in to the city, I mean, you see pictures like this where the buildings are half standing or mostly down. But the Soviets took up positions in the rubble that remained of Stalingrad, and they engaged the advancing German troops in bitter house-to-house, building-to-building fighting. In mid-November, taking advantage of the harsh Russian winter that the Soviets were used to, but the German troops, I mean, I think this was more than they bargained for. They didn't realize how cold, bitterly cold it would get. And, in the middle of this winter, the Soviet forces counterattacked and surrounded the German army. And so this house to house, street to street fighting, really the tables turned because of the weather. And the Nazis are running out of supplies. Their supply lines are strung out way too far, uh, even considering their advanced transportation methods and their great technology. Their supply lines are too far from Berlin to the into the heart of Russia. And so in late January, the Red Army launches a final assault on the German army, who is freezing to death and running out of supplies. And uh, on January 31st, 1943, more than 90,000 surviving Germans surrender. In all, Germany lost around 330,000 troops in the Battle of Stalingrad. And of course, Russia never released its official data on its casualties because they were so high. But the Soviet army wins the battle. And this is going to be the turning point of the war in the East. After their victory here at Stalingrad, Soviet forces begin a long struggle to regain the territory in their own country that they had lost to the Germans when the Germans first invaded. The Red Army is going to push the Germans back. Okay, now, of course, at Stalingrad, they won a decisive victory, and 90,000 German troops surrender. Okay, but there are a couple other battles that are going on as well that are just horrific in their scope. And, all these battles that we're talking about here in Russia, they're some of the worst battles in all of World War II. But just a few pictures of Stalingrad here, some German soldiers clearing the streets. I mean, this is what's left of, after the bombing campaign. But you never knew where the Russians might be, right? Hiding out. So you can imagine how on edge everybody was. There's a picture of just, the rubble. Just, oh my goodness. And here are some Russians fighting off the advancing Germans that are coming into the city, taking up, strategic positions, trying defensive positions. You got to keep your town, right? You got to keep your livelihood. More pictures of the Russians fighting back against the Germans. I mean, this is one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. And at the end, late January, German soldiers being taken prisoner, surrendering, being surrounded by the Russians. And many of the Germans are freezing to death, starving to death. Um, you know, crazy, crazy. And a picture of some victorious Russian troops after the Battle of Stalingrad. But now begins the work of rebuilding your city. First, you got to worry about winning the war and defeating the Nazi war machine, and then you can rebuild your city. Now that takes us to the Battle of Leningrad. The Battle of Leningrad is going to be also one of the worst battles of the war, and here's what's going to happen. The Germans are going to lay siege to the city of Leningrad, and what that means is they're going to surround the city and just bomb the heck out of it, kind of like they did in Stalingrad, right? Is where they just tried to bomb Stalingrad into submission, then send troops in. Well, in Leningrad, and we'll get to some of the specific details here in a minute, but the Germans surround the city and just launch artillery from their tanks and so forth, and just try to destroy Leningrad and make it, ground it down to powder, and then it'll be easy to take, right? Then they can move their troops in and it'll be easy. But that's not what happened. As far as it being easy, they did lay siege to the city for a long time, and they shelled the heck out of the city and destroyed much of the city and killed a lot of people. But the Russians dug in, and they were tough and gritty. And the Russians, the Germans had the city surrounded, so you couldn't get supplies in. You couldn't get people out to go get supplies and bring them back in. And so the Russians are starving. They're eating anything they can. They're eating, the leather from their shoes. They're taking the wallpaper off their walls and licking the glue on the back of it from any kind of nourishment they could. I don't know what nourishment that would give you, but they're trying to get something. And they will end up fighting off the Germans once the Germans come into the city, and fighting off the Germans to the point where now the Germans, by the end of this thing, are going to be running out of supplies, like they did in Stalingrad. The Germans are going to be freezing. You'd have German troops go to sleep at night, and the morning would come around, and there'd be a bunch of frozen, stiff German soldiers that had frozen to death and died that night. Okay, and so the Russians are able to fend off the Germans at Leningrad in one of the great stories of courage and perseverance and determination, really, among a people in the history of war. So here's some pictures I'm going to show you from Leningrad. Just shells coming in, just knocking out buildings. Of course, you got people just walking on the street trying to live their life, right? And they know the enemy's outside there and going to shell them, and they just hope they don't get hit. You have dead people lying in the streets, right, as a result of the artillery shelling. This was a very real thing. You're walking around town doing some shopping, or trying to find some resources to buy, or whatever, and a shell comes in. That was something you had to live with. I can't imagine that. Another picture of dead on the sidewalk, right, as a result of the siege. Russian citizens clearing rubble after being shelled by the German artillery, right? So how long did this siege last? Well, it lasted for 872 days. It lasted over 2 years, from September of 1941 to January of 1944. Can you imagine that? And you got the snow, and you got the rubble from the buildings, and you're trying to clear things out, and oh my goodness, these people were just tougher than nails. Okay, so that's the Battle of Stalingrad and Leningrad. Now you can read books on them and watch shows about them to really get a lot of the nitty gritty details, right? And you can get a lot of the specifics. But that's an overall, you just overview. But a third battle, of course, the Battle of Moscow. I love this picture, though. The Russian military parade to lift spirits just before the Battle of Moscow. Troops went from the parade directly to fight. That's crazy. I love the Russian architecture, though. Okay, especially those, um, those buildings look like they have, Christmas bulbs on them, Christmas lights, bulbs, cool stuff. But I mean, man, alive. Can you imagine being a Red Army soldier and going, okay, well, I have a gun and my friend doesn't, perhaps because there's not enough to go around, and so if I die, he'll pick up my gun. But this other guy over here has extra bullets, so if he dies, I'm going to pick up those. And I mean, that was a real thing, because they were going up against a superior fighting force in the German military. And again, it was just the Russians, just true grit and determination, and the Germans getting too far into Russian territory and having supply lines too strung out, and battling the weather. Mother Nature got them, is what does in the Germans. There's Russian troops in the Battle of Moscow, marching along. Here's an action scene from the battle. You can see the white, right, to blend in with the snow. But again, old man winter, right? German tanks get caught in the snow. The tank treads won't work. They're frozen stiff, and you can't move your tanks. And I mean, the guys start freezing, and oh boy. And German dead outside of the city. Coldest winter in 40 years that the Germans just happened to experience. 10,000 German troops died during the Battle of Moscow. And of course, this is going to be the smallest of the three that we just briefly mentioned, with Stalingrad, Leningrad, and Moscow. But I mean, some of these German troops could have died from bullets or from artillery shells or from freezing to death, or you name it. German troops surrendered to Russian troops at the Battle of Moscow. Right, we're running out of food. Our tank won't won't move. We got nothing left. We're going to go and try to find civilization somewhere, so we surrender. Right, and the Russians didn't like the Germans too much, and Germans didn't like the Russians too much. So you did not want to be a prisoner of war in either one of those camps. And finally, another picture from the Battle of Moscow. I wrote on here, can you imagine having to clean that up? Oh my goodness. But the Russian people went out in the end, and the Red Army chases what's left of the German army in Russia back toward Germany. Those German soldiers that retreated, the Russians are going to chase them back. They're not just going to let them go. They're going to chase them back to Germany and try to finish them off there.